The grand halls of the Spanish royal palace glowed with candlelight, as music and laughter echoed through marble corridors. It was the wedding night of King Ferdinand VII and Maria Antonia of Naples, a young queen raised with dreams of romance and royal duty, draped in silks and surrounded by well-wishers. She had no idea that she was walking into a nightmare from which she would never truly recover. Behind the sealed doors of the royal bedchamber, where passion was expected and heirs were to be conceived, a disturbing reality awaited, one that had been hidden behind protocol as a top royal secret. As the final candles dimmed and the palace fell into a hushed slumber, the royal bedchamber became the stage for a private catastrophe. Maria Antonia, dressed in delicate lace and trembling with a mix of nervousness and duty, awaited her new husband. She had been prepared for royal responsibility, but nothing could have prepared her for the shock that entered the room. When Ferdinand disrobed, what she saw was not merely shocking, it was monstrous. His manhood, distorted and disproportionately oversized, bore the physical scars of generations of royal inbreeding. This was not intimacy, this was something unnatural. Their attempts to consummate the marriage descended into chaos. Maria cried out in pain. Attempts to proceed were halted as attendants were discreetly summoned. Pillows were arranged beneath her, ointments applied, and strange tools used in desperate improvisation. But nothing worked. The queen was left bruised, both physically and emotionally. The king, enraged by her failure, slipped into silent humiliation. Neither spoke of what happened that night, but the silence between them would grow into a chasm. The bond that should have united them was instead shattered before it ever formed. That night would mark the beginning of a marriage forged not by love, but by pain, shame, and irreversible psychological scars. Born in 1784 into the powerful but disturbingly entangled Bourbon dynasty, Ferdinand VII was a product of centuries of royal inbreeding. His parents, Charles IV of Spain and Maria Luisa of Parma, were both deeply rooted in the same family tree, as were most of Europe's monarchs at the time. But in Spain, the effects were especially grotesque. Ferdinand inherited more than just a crown. He inherited a legacy of physical deformities, erratic behavior, and a bloodline riddled with congenital afflictions. Some whispered that the Bourbon family's insistence on keeping their royal blood pure had cursed them. For Ferdinand, the curse took a peculiar form, an abnormally large, misshapen penis, a grotesque that would come to define and change his personal life. In the days that followed the disastrous wedding night, something in the palace shifted. Though the royal court maintained its formal rituals, beneath the surface, whispers began to fester like an untreated wound. Servants spoke in hushed tones of the strange cries they'd heard and the physicians' hurried midnight visits. Nobles who once toasted the young couple now traded curious glances and riddled remarks in salons and corridors. The king's deformity, never mentioned aloud, became the most dangerous open secret in Spain, and as the rumors grew louder, so did Ferdinand's paranoia. Haunted by the silent humiliation, Ferdinand became increasingly withdrawn. He suspected everyone, his servants, his advisors, even his wife, of laughing behind his back. He began to avoid public appearances and demanded stricter control over who had access to the royal quarters. Maria Antonia, already traumatized, was now isolated, silenced, and blamed. Her pain was invisible to a court that cared only for heirs and appearances. Ferdinand's shame transformed into bitterness, and bitterness into a thirst for control. He could not silence the whispers outside, so he began tightening his grip inside. Ferdinand surrounded himself with an odd mix of court physicians, mystics, and folk healers. He was no longer satisfied with standard remedies. He demanded results. Each advisor brought with them increasingly bizarre fertility solutions. Aphrodisiacs made of ground horn, exotic herbs from the colonies, and black market tonics rumored to enhance virility. Some were laced with mercury or opium. Still, Ferdinand consumed them daily, convinced they would improve his potency. Driven by an unrelenting fear of failure, he became obsessed with Maria's reproductive cycle. Her body became a subject of constant surveillance. Servants were ordered to note her mood swings, appetite, and even her sleep patterns. All of it was logged and studied. When she ovulated, Ferdinand would prepare days in advance, purifying himself, meditating and preparing the chamber for intercourse like a sacred ritual. But this was no act of intimacy. It was a mechanical operation. Ferdinand developed a belief that restraint during and after sex would increase the chances of conception. He forced Maria to lie perfectly still afterwards, sometimes for hours, while incense burned and chants from his advisors echoed softly through the corridors. If she so much as shifted, he grew angry. Some sources suggest that he even had her lightly bound to the bedposts, insisting it would trap the royal seed. As the pressure mounted, Maria's physical and mental health declined. Trapped in an endless loop of rituals, schedules, and emotional neglect, she turned to the only relief available: laudanum. The opium-based tincture was commonly prescribed for anxiety and sleep, but Maria's use became habitual. It dulled the pain, quieted her dread, but also weakened her body. Throughout the marriage, each one devastated her, but for Ferdinand, they were proof of her inadequacy. He never questioned the rituals, the stress, or the poisons he fed himself daily. The fault was always hers. He began withdrawing emotionally, growing colder, harsher, and more mechanical in his demands. Then, in 1805, after yet another troubled pregnancy, Maria gave birth to a stillborn. Maria Antonia of Naples died not long after, but no inquiry followed. She is much of a burden already. Ferdinand felt no guilt. His eyes had already turned toward his next bride. He believed somehow the second time would be different, with his first wife dead and the dream of a royal heir still unfulfilled. Ferdinand VII of Spain set his sights on a second bride, this time a woman closer to home. In 1816, he married Maria Isabel of Portugal, his niece. The union, like the last, was politically strategic, meant to reinforce Bourbon solidarity. But for Ferdinand, the goal was painfully singular: a son. From the beginning, the palace held its breath. Maria Isabel was young, healthy, and compliant. Surely this time the king's twisted quest for an heir would bear fruit. But Ferdinand had changed. Scarred by repeated failures, his methods grew more obsessive and invasive. Every aspect of Maria's life was governed by ritual sexual encounters, scheduled with precision, body temperatures monitored, dreams interpreted for omens. What had once been whispered as eccentricity had become a disturbing daily routine. Medical personnel were routinely stationed near the royal chambers. Special diets were enforced. Superstition fused with science, and Maria found herself locked in a life of relentless reproductive regimens. Ferdinand yet again failed to learn from his experience, reportedly forcing Maria Isabel of Portugal to participate in even more extreme fertility rituals, including long periods of post-intercourse immobility, incense-filled rooms, and symbolic blessings conducted by mystics. Maria Isabel suffered greatly. Between 1817 and 1818, she endured multiple pregnancies, none of which ended in joy. One miscarriage, then another, then another. Each loss was met not with sympathy, but with royal fury. Ferdinand viewed every failed pregnancy as a personal betrayal, evidence that his bloodline was being sabotaged by a weak vessel. In 1818, Maria Isabel of Portugal gave birth to a stillborn daughter. That same year, she died at just 21 years old. The official cause? Complications from childbirth. But few believed it was that simple. Court rumors whispered of mental and physical exhaustion deliberately pushed past the point of survival. Some believed Maria Isabel had given up the will to live, crushed under the weight of duty and delusion. And yet, the cycle continued. Just 1 year later, Ferdinand married again. His third wife was Maria Josepha Amalia of Saxony, a devout Catholic and just 16 years old at the time of their union. She was pure, pious, and terrified. She reportedly refused to consummate the marriage for months, believing intercourse itself to be sinful. For Ferdinand, this defiance was unbearable. He became enraged, accusing her of rebellion, of failing in her sacred role. The clergy were summoned, and after intense pressure, Josepha was convinced or coerced into surrendering. Allegations emerged of forced consummation, though the details remain murky. What is certain is that the marriage bore no children, and Josepha lived in quiet misery until her death a few years later. No grand scandal, no dramatic collapse, just silence. Another broken life tucked neatly into Ferdinand's growing trail of ruined queens. Still no heir, still no redemption. But Ferdinand wasn't finished yet. By the time Ferdinand VII buried his third wife, the Spanish court had begun to see the truth. This was no longer just a king desperate for an heir, this was a man unraveling. What began as insecurity had morphed into full-blown obsession. And that obsession now ruled the palace. Ferdinand's identity was inseparable from his grotesque anatomy and repeated failures to sire a child. But instead of questioning his methods or seeking solace, he doubled down, turning the royal household into a ritualized, fearful machine. Each day brought new routines, sacred oils to cleanse the seed, chants from hand-picked mystics, and timed intimacy sessions dictated by celestial readings. Women in the palace, servants, ladies-in-waiting, even visiting nobles, found themselves watched, judged, and in some cases, tested. Ferdinand, convinced his misfortune stemmed from impure surroundings, began subjecting women to invasive examinations, desperate to control every variable. Some were dismissed for perceived spiritual impurity. Others were punished for gossip or simply for being in the wrong place at the wrong time. The king no longer sought a partner, he sought a solution, and he would try anything. Those who once mocked him in hushed tones now lived in dread. The palace had become a house of silence, its golden walls echoing with the weight of secrets, of shame, of something far worse than incompetence, madness with absolute power. But Ferdinand wasn't done. He had one more queen to choose, and this time the child would come, no matter what it cost. By 1829, Ferdinand VII was aging, ill, and childless, 3 failed marriages behind him and no heir to show for it. The pressure was immense. Spain teetered on the edge of another dynastic crisis. And so, at age 45, the king made one final attempt. His bride was Maria Cristina of the Two Sicilies, a 23-year-old princess and his own niece, yet another Bourbon family match. But unlike his previous wives, Maria Cristina brought something different to the palace: restraint, intelligence, and ambition cloaked beneath obedience. She was soft-spoken, careful, and politically astute, traits she had learned from her royal upbringing in Naples. She knew the stakes. And more importantly, she knew how to survive a man like Ferdinand. The marriage, though still a product of dynastic necessity, unfolded more smoothly than those before it. Ferdinand, now slowed by illness and age, was less aggressive, though no less determined to produce an heir. Maria Cristina played the part he needed, dutiful, discreet, and emotionally distant enough to avoid provoking his suspicions. A year into their marriage, in October of 1830, she gave birth to a child. But it was not the long-awaited son. It was a daughter, Isabella. Ferdinand's initial reaction was not joy, but disappointment. Centuries of male succession had defined the Spanish monarchy. A daughter was not the solution. It was a complication. But as Ferdinand's health deteriorated and the hope of siring another child faded, his mindset shifted. If he couldn't have a son, he would make Isabella queen, by force of law if necessary. In 1830, he issued the Pragmatic Sanction, a decree that overturned centuries of Salic law in Spain, which barred female succession. It was a bold and controversial move, one that infuriated his brother Don Carlos, who believed he was the rightful heir. The court buzzed with tension. Supporters of Carlos labeled the sanctions a political stunt. They claimed Isabella wasn't even Ferdinand's real daughter, accusing Maria Cristina of infidelity, a charge with no proof but plenty of political utility. After all, Ferdinand had spent years surrounded by mystics, medicines, and failure. How could he have suddenly fathered a healthy child in his late 40s? The rumors were cruel and effective. They painted Maria Cristina as manipulative, seducing a dying king to crown her own child and seize power through the back door. Some whispered that Isabella's real father was Agustin Muñoz, a young palace guard rumored to have caught the queen's eye. But Ferdinand didn't care, or perhaps he chose not to listen. He declared Isabella legitimate, named her Princess of Asturias, and made it clear that when he died, she would reign. Maria Cristina played her part perfectly. She did not confront the rumors. She did not engage with the court whispers. Instead, she stayed close to her husband, attending to him daily as his condition worsened. Publicly, she was the image of devotion and maternal virtue. Behind closed doors, however, she was consolidating power, gathering allies, reading legal texts, writing letters to Europe's royal houses. She knew that the war for Isabella's crown would begin the moment Ferdinand took his last breath. And so did Ferdinand. In his final year, he was paranoid and increasingly frail. He demanded that Isabella be carried into court ceremonies, paraded before nobles and foreign ambassadors. She was a toddler dressed like a queen, her presence a warning to all who doubted the king's will. But even Ferdinand could not control death. His body was failing, his mind fraying, and yet he clung to one idea, that he would be remembered not as a failed monarch, but as the father of a queen. By 1833, Ferdinand VII was extremely weak. His body, once bloated with pride and potions, was now frail and sunken. Years of self-prescribed aphrodisiacs, toxic tonics, and emotional rage had taken their toll. He was plagued by painful swelling, infections, and episodes of delirium. Doctors came and went, but none could reverse the damage. In his final days, Ferdinand's mind flickered between reality and hallucination. He was said to mutter about heirs, demons, and fire. At times, he wept over Isabella's future. At others, he raged, demanding that no one question his bloodline, his legacy, or his manhood. On September 29, 1833, Ferdinand VII died. He was 49. But even in death, he remained a subject of grotesque fascination. According to court legend, the royal physician, perhaps under orders or simply out of curiosity, preserved the king's deformed genitalia in a jar. It was said to be enormous, discolored, and veiny, suspended in a murky solution. The jar was sealed, hidden, and whispered about for decades. Some believed it was kept as a medical specimen, others said it was locked away to prevent future disgrace. A few even claimed it was shown to close confidants as proof of the king's curse. Where it ended up remains a mystery. Some say it was destroyed in a palace fire. Others claim it's buried deep within royal archives. But one thing is certain. Ferdinand's reign did not end quietly. His body was laid to rest in royal splendor, but his legacy lived on in hushed tones and candlelit rumors. He had left behind a daughter to rule, a wife to fight, and a relic too grotesque for history books. Ferdinand VII may have died, but the chaos he left behind outlived him. His daughter, Isabella II, just 3 years old, was proclaimed queen, but her throne was anything but secure. Ferdinand's decision to overturn the centuries-old Salic law and name a female heir sparked outrage across Spain. His brother, Don Carlos, refused to recognize Isabella's claim. Instead, he declared himself the rightful king, igniting the bloody First Carlist War, a brutal civil conflict that would rage for years. What should have been a smooth transition of power became a national catastrophe. The monarchy was now stained not just by political instability, but by shame, trauma, and scandal. Behind closed doors, nobles whispered of the king who had ruled through superstition and cruelty, the man who turned queens into patients and bedrooms into laboratories, the man whose obsession with his anatomy destroyed 3 wives, alienated a nation, and nearly tore apart a dynasty. Even those loyal to Isabella were forced to reckon with the grotesque shadow of her father. Teachers avoided his name in schools, historians tiptoed around his personal life, yet no one could fully erase it. Ferdinand's legacy was not just written in decrees, but in the emotional scars he left behind.